You might have heard a religious person addressing the question of how there can be suffering despite there being a good, all-powerful, all-knowing God, with the response that we don't see the bigger picture. We don't see things from God's perspective, and it's possible, in fact, it must be the case, if you believe in God, and a good God, that there is some redemptive quality behind all suffering in this world. But the feeling that sometimes leaves people with is like, well, that's very easy for you to say, or it's very easy for God to say, right? But at the end of the day, there's huge amounts of suffering still, and I can't see the bigger picture here, and it's very painful, whether or not there is a big picture or not. So I wanted to talk about this in a bit more detail and challenge some assumptions we have about this religious perspective. The analogy that's sometimes given is that of a parent, for example, taking their child to get an injection. The child's too young to understand what's going on, and the child's screaming in pain, thinking they've been abandoned by their parent, or their parents putting them in danger, and the parent has to watch as the child is screaming in pain, but they still will let that child go through that suffering because they know that the child needs to get the injection. And people sometimes cite a direct quote from Devarim, the final book of the Torah in Deuteronomy, that says, where God says, "Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, so the Lord your God disciplines you." It's saying that exact point. And so the idea is, we're just the child. We don't know the bigger perspective. We don't know the parent's perspective. And if we did, we would understand. And that's the way to think about it. But the thing we miss from this is, if that is the analogy, there's an added component, isn't there, to this analogy, which is that whenever a child is going through pain, who is in more pain when it occurs? In a healthy family. The parent who's watching the child in pain, or the child himself? Ask any healthy, relatively kind parent, and they will often say that they would rather have the pain themselves than see their child suffer. That actually, the pain of watching someone you love, your child, go through pain is even more painful than the pain the child themselves are experiencing. Loving means you're vulnerable to pain. Then how much more so is God's love, which is infinite? How much more so is his pain? When he's in pain, he's in an infinite amount of pain when he sees his loved ones suffering. So who suffers more when we suffer, when we have to go through these things? When you think about it from this perspective, it changes the dynamics a bit, because sometimes we think, well, God does things, and yeah, it's all for our best because he loves us, but it's very easy for him. He sits up on high on his throne, all very comfortable and easy for him. No, that can't be the case. It must be if he is our creator, our partner in heaven, our Father in heaven, then actually he is the one that experiences even more pain than his children, than his loved ones, when they go through suffering. You know, it's interesting, in the Passover Haggadah, we've got Passover coming up soon. The story of Passover, which we discuss, the Haggadah discusses, it says, quote, talks about early Jewish history, and God says, "And I took your father Abraham from beyond the river, and I led him throughout the whole of Canaan. I increased his seed and gave him Isaac. And to Isaac I gave Jacob, and to Esau I gave Mount Seir to possess it. And Jacob and his sons went down to Egypt." Very interesting. At every stage of this, until the very last part, God says, here's what I did. I gave him this, I gave Isaac that, I did this, I did that. But then it talks about Jacob and his sons going down to Egypt, and it's suddenly impersonal. It doesn't say, I sent Jacob and his sons down to Egypt. It says, and Jacob and his sons went down to Egypt. Why does it say that? Why is it written in this impersonal way? You know, so much of Passover is about thanking God for taking us out of Egypt, but a question that should be sort of haunting us a bit at the back of our minds is, well, who put us in Egypt in the first place? Right? It's all very well to be grateful for God taking you out of suffering, but who put you there in the first place? So the way I heard it explained fits in with everything we've been saying. When a president or a prime minister or a king or a queen sends their army to war to fight a battle to protect their country, it doesn't exactly give them immense sense of joy. It's necessary. They need to do it. Do they want to see their citizens die for them, die for their country? No, absolutely not. But they do it because they need to protect their country. There's something valuable at stake here. But then, what about the homecoming? What about when the soldiers return home from battle? That's also something that the president or the king or the prime minister or the queen has to order and enact. But in that case, that is personal. That's when the leader of the country will go out and salute all the soldiers as they return home, and there'll be a big celebration. That's personal. That's a pleasure. They needed to send them to war. They want to have them safe and well back home. So God may have needed to send us down to Egypt. But what does he want? He wants to take us out of Egypt. So it says in an impersonal way that Jacob and his sons went down to Egypt because God's not particularly happy about that decision, about making that happen. But it's something he needed to make happen. But what gives him personal pleasure, what he does want to make a celebration out of, is the alleviation of suffering, and rather the celebration of goodness and joy. So it's really important to see things in that light. You know, after the Holocaust and all the tragedies of the early and mid-20th century, Time magazine put out a front page piece where they popularized the phrase, "God is dead." I think it was first articulated by Nietzsche, but that became a very popular and oft repeated phrase after the war, and I think in the 50s and 60s. God is dead. You know, in Judaism we say that even wrong ideas that are particularly popular at a time in history are there to bring out something or to teach us something. And this idea of God is dead, on some level, some metaphorical level, given the extent of suffering that God had to watch his children, his creations endure in that time in history. If you wanted to use a bit of poetic license, you could say, yeah, for him to experience that level of pain, a piece of him may have died too. You know, in a metaphorical, poetic sense, there's always something there to learn from, to take from any idea or any concept. If that was the response of the time, God is dead, yeah, on some level, it would be incredibly overwhelming for a loving parent, a loving creator, to have watched all this misery and suffering. And this is why the Jewish response to suffering is not simply to say, oh, well, it's all for the good. Because while that may be the case, that's not meant to be where our sensitivities lie. Perhaps you can say that's where we should accept our challenges and suffering with love for our own sufferings and our own challenges in order to, you know, function as best we can and serve others and our God as best we can. But for the suffering that we see around us, we're not meant to like it or accept it at all. We're meant to hate it and want to alleviate it. And the reason for that is because God hates it. God doesn't like it. And you know, it's interesting because we often hear from atheists or people who say they don't believe in God. They're really just mad at God. And they say, how can God allow all this suffering to occur? All these illnesses, poverty. But read the Torah. Where did we even get this idea that we should care about healing the sick? Who told us to care for the poor? Who told us I am my brother's keeper? God was the one that first told us to develop these sensitivities because he too hates them. Why he puts up with it? We don't know. We expect a good answer. In fact, the answer has to be overwhelmingly good and positive because the suffering has been so overwhelmingly bad. It has to be a yin and yang, it has to be a balance. If the suffering has been overwhelmingly painful, then that means the redemptive value in it has to be overwhelmingly good. And so our approach to suffering is not simply and should not simply be to say it serves a greater goal. We can't see the bigger picture, which is true. Why should we be able to expect to understand God, the infinite creator? I can't even understand some other people in my life. Why should we expect to understand God? But that shouldn't be where our sensitivities end. The sensitivity should be on the fact that God hates it, He wants it to stop, He wants us to partner with Him in stopping it. And while for ourselves we are allowed, or perhaps even encouraged, to try to just be as strong as possible, but for others, our sensitivity should be outraged with suffering, protesting at it, hating it, because God detests it even more. And so that religious idea that you may hear people tell you, that we believe if you peel back the curtain just a little bit, you'll see the goodness within suffering. In Judaism, we say actually, while you might find that, what you'll also find, if you peel back the curtain, is the suffering of a good God. I'm Ollie Annisfeld, and you're watching JTV.